The C.S. Lewis Institute presents Questioning Belief with your host, Dr. Kathleen Milani. Welcome to the Questioning Belief podcast, hosted by the C.S. Lewis Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Noller, former atheist turned Christian and biomedical scientist. Let's dive past the surface of Christianity together and see if it withstands your toughest objections. On today's episode, we tackle the following objection. Religion, like political belief, is a personal and private matter. Aside from professional theologians or clergy whose job it is to handle religious matters, the lay Christian is neither equipped nor should feel emboldened to discuss their personal beliefs with others who do not share them. They risk coming across as inappropriate and judgmental, and it is ultimately God who predestines people for salvation or otherwise, not the evangelistic actions of human beings. So to discuss this objection and more objections, such as declarations like all religions are the same and Christians are hypocrites, we have with us Dr. Andy Bannister, and he is the Director of Solas, an evangelism and training organization based in Scotland. He's a sought-after speaker and teacher and regularly addresses audiences of both Christians and those of all faiths or no faith on issues of faith, culture, politics, and society. Two of his highly acclaimed books that we'll be touching on today are How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, a panic-free guide to having natural conversations about your faith, and Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? He has a Ph.D. in Islamic Studies. He's taught extensively at universities across the world. He's an adjunct research fellow at Melbourne School of Theology, and he's also adjunct faculty at Wycliffe College in Toronto. So welcome, Dr. Bannister. Thank you for being here.
It's a real pleasure, Kathleen. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a guest on the podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too. So before we get started with the questions and the objections that I mentioned, I'd love for our listeners to hear a little bit about your background, how you first became involved in Christian apologetics, and why you chose to focus on Islamic studies for your PhD.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kathleen. Well, two great questions, and they actually intersect because what happened for me was, until the late 1990s, I hadn't really thought much about, certainly not much about Islam, certainly not much about, the intellectual aspect of defending the Christian faith, what we might call apologetics. I was very active in my faith. I've been a Christian since my teens. I was involved in youth ministry, and then one day, a guy came to our church and did a presentation on Islam and reaching Muslim neighbours. And he described how every Sunday afternoon he was going up to a place in London, England, called Speaker's Corner, which is part of one of our big parks in London. And it's sort of become known as the world centre of free speech. And at Speaker's Corner, you can stand on a ladder or a box, or if you're my height, a ladder and a box, and you can get a crowd, and people talk about religion, politics, sport, you name it. And he was going there to Speaker's Corner because he'd figured out there were loads of Muslims who'd gone to preach Islam, so he'd gone to preach to them. And it was amazing, some of the stories he shared. We got talking after the seminar, Kathleen, and he said, Andy, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner next week and see what we do? So I went up to London the following week. He met me at the train station, and he had two ladders with him, one on each shoulder. And I said, Jay, why have you got two ladders? He said, well, I'm going to stand on one and preach, and you're going to stand on the other and preach. And I went, I've never preached on the street before. He said, oh, it's easy. Any fool could do it. And then I followed up with, I've never talked to a Muslim before. He went, oh, they're easy. Anyone could talk to a Muslim. Kathleen, he was wrong on both counts.
Oh, I'm sure.
Spectacularly wrong. Because I got on the ladder and they ate me alive. The Muslims there were used to talking to Christians. I had no idea what I was doing. I looked very stupid in public. Got down from the ladder, my head spinning, thinking, well, maybe I ought to become a Muslim because they seem to have all the answers and I have nothing. Went home, but I thought before I do anything stupid, I should maybe, ask around. So I went to the local Christian bookstore the next day, told them my story, and the guy behind the counter said, Andy, what you need is apologetics. And it was the first time I'd heard that word. It sounded like a breakfast cereal, actually, but, as you know, it's not. It's the branch of theology, can some given reasons. He sold me some books, including, by the way, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. That was one of the first books I bought. And I read and read and read, went back to Speaker's Corner 2 weeks later, and they had new questions, and I looked stupid again. And for that, Corner on the weekend, and then I'd read during the week to kind of try and catch up. And over the next 3 months or so, Kathleen, God just did a work through me, really. He caused me to fall in love with just engaging Muslims. And to this day, I just find them wonderful, fascinating people to engage.
Mm.
I love their passion. I love the energy. I love you don't have to beat around the bush like you do with atheist friends. You can get straight in there.
Mm.
And I also fell in love with just talking about the reasons why I think we can have confidence that Christianity is true, and that eventually led to getting a PhD in Islamic studies. So be careful where you go on a Sunday afternoon is the moral of that story.
Yes. Oh my goodness. It's such a lesson in God leading your life and sort of being open to how the Spirit leads you. I listened to your book. I didn't read it in print. I listened to it in audiobook, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. And I just have to mention to all of our listeners there, I really recommend the audiobook. It was just delightful to listen to. I laughed a
Thank you.
lot. I had a great time. So there's just that plug before we get into this.
That's very,
But
very kind. The check's in the mail. So thank you.
yes, yes. Thank you. So, who is this book intended
Mm,
for? And so you mentioned panic in the title.
yes.
And I think a lot of us, even folks who are a little bit more experienced in talking to non Christians, still have panic when some of those conversations come
Yeah.
up, or fear, whatever the word is. Um, so who's the book for, and where does the panic come from on our end?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Again, so many brilliant questions there. So in one sense, I suppose the way to begin is saying that book was aimed at the 25-year-old me,
Mm,
because the Speaker's Corner story was the late 1990s. Before that, in the mid to early 1990s, my first job was working for the health service in the UK. I worked for a local hospital, helping organise medical conferences, and I loved my job. But I came to realise, looking back on that time, that I was very much an undercover Christian, that in the
mhm.
workplace I just kept my faith quiet. I was very
Yeah.
active in my church, as I described earlier, but that stayed outside of work. Inside work, I just didn't know how to talk about my faith. I was afraid. I mean, panic is probably a good word. That's why we used it on the book you mentioned. I sort of thought, gosh, if I try and talk about my faith, I'm going to look like an idiot. I'm going to let God
Mm,
down. It's going to go wrong in so many ways, and all of those fears just meant I said nothing. And it was some years later, actually, talking to other Christians, that I realized, gosh, I'm not alone, actually. A lot of Christians, I think, are afraid, as you hinted at there. Panic, fear, nervousness. What if I make a mess of it? What if I get fired? What if it all goes badly wrong? And so we say nothing. And survey after survey has picked up that many Christians are, as one comedian put it, we're like Arctic rivers in that we have frozen mouths and
mm,
we don't say anything. So that book
yeah.
really, I began to think, what's the kind of book that I wish I'd picked up when I was 21, 22, when I was younger. And then I looked around and I realized a lot of books, I think, on evangelism. There are some brilliant books out there. There really are. But I think a lot of them are a bit more advanced. They sort of assume that you're already sort of doing it and engaged. And
Mhm.
some of them actually the people writing them, you look at it and think, gosh, I wish I was as clever as you were.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to write not quite evangelism for dummies, but a book that's like, okay, if I'm terrified, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to start, a book that will help you sort of begin to work through those fears, and then help put some practical tools in your hands so that any of us can begin thinking, do you know what? I could talk about my faith at work, at school,
Mhm.
with my friends. And do you know what? Actually, maybe God could use even me.
Mm. And I like in your book that you mentioned that sometimes even looking at these really prolific writers or famous apologists, Tim Keller, C.S. Lewis, or other folks like that, can be inspiring, but sometimes
Yeah.
intimidating in a way that ends up inhibiting our courage and our pursuit of apologetics as well. And so that seems like very much at play with your objective there.
Very much true. I think I told the story in the book, right? That a major moment for me, I think, on that journey to the fear, ironically, was when I was 19. Billy Graham, the amazing Billy Graham,
Hmm.
came to the UK on one of his tours, and he preached at a place in London called Crystal Palace Stadium, up down the road from where I used to live. So myself and a load of mates from church went off to hear him. And I remember watching Billy preach, and I remember sitting at the back of the stadium, listening to him preach, thinking, well, that wasn't the most dynamic sermon, actually, because he was a fairly straightforward old school preacher, and I confess I wasn't that impressed. And then
Mm,
the altar call was made, and 5,000 people went forward. And the 19-year-old me didn't go, oh, wow, look at how God's used him. I
yeah.
responded the other way and went, oh, my word, surely, therefore, this proves that to be an evangelist, you need to be miraculously anointed. You
Mhm.
need to have some
Mhm.
incredible spiritual gift, such that Billy has, and praise the Lord for Billy Graham, because the rest of us haven't got it. And I think I
Mhm.
walked out not encouraged, but well, encouraged there was a Billy Graham, but discouraged that that wasn't for the likes of you and I. And again, talking to other people since, I've realised I'm not alone in this. You mentioned, Tim Keller, C.S. Lewis, Rebecca McLaughlin. There are all these brilliant men and women out there who are absolute geniuses. Um, and they're amazing, and I'm grateful to God for every single one of them. But sometimes I think for us lesser mortals in the church, we can look at those people and go, I can't do that. I'm just not that eloquent. I'm not that gifted. But the good news is God can use any of us. And by the way, in the book, the biblical example I use to start us off on that, think of Jonah in the Bible, probably the world's worst evangelist. Tries to run away from God. God has to use the whole whale business to get him to Nineveh. He goes to Nineveh. He preaches the world's most pathetic, useless sermon, 5 words in the Hebrew. The whole city repents, and even then, he doesn't go, "Amazing, God's used me." He goes and sits under a tree and has a screaming grumpy fit. Because he wanted to see, Nineveh buried under fire and brimstone. If God can use a man like Jonah, he can use any one of us listening to this podcast.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It's such a good point. And I think oftentimes the personality of the speaker is so important too for those stadium speakers like Billy Graham or Tim Keller, somebody who's just so magnetic or winsome. And, that may not be something that everybody possesses. It may not be a gift everyone has to be able to speak in a stadium, but that certainly doesn't mean you are not able to speak in those smaller groups or one-on-one
Yeah,
interactions.
and the other thing I think that's helpful to realize as well, for folks listening to this, Kathleen, is a couple of other things very briefly on that. One is that
Mhm.
not everyone's going to go to a stadium. So if the only way we could reach people for the gospel is stadiums, how do we reach people who are never going to set foot in one? However, everyone listening to this podcast who's a Christian will have friends, maybe family, neighbors, who you may be the only real Christian they know, but
Mhm.
you've got that connection with them, and you may be the person that God would have reach them in your own way. And then secondly, the in your own way is important. I think every one of us has a different evangelistic style. My
Mhm.
style is not your style. Your style is not Rebecca McLaughlin's style. The list goes on and on and on, and going, we're all different. And I think God's done that deliberately in his economy, actually. And we need the stadium speakers. We absolutely do. But we also need the people who are really good at hospitality, who can invite a friend out for a coffee and just build that rapport, and then quietly, one to one, just talk about what Jesus and the gospel, means to them. We need that whole range of things. And so I think another lesson I've learned over the years is don't be ashamed of the way God has made you. Rather be asking the Lord, okay, this is how you've made me. How
Mhm.
can I reach the people you've put in front of me using the style and the personality you've given me? And ask the Holy Spirit to work through you rather than feeling you should be like somebody you're not.
Mhm. Yes, very well said. I want to touch back on the fear earlier that we
Mm,
mentioned. Fear of apologetics, fear of becoming an evangelist, fear of talking about Christianity, whatever it might be. And I would say some people have different reactions to this fear. One reaction is, well, we're not persecuted the same way that people in
mm,
Iran are, the same way that, folks are in other parts of the world. So we shouldn't have fear at all. And it's wrong to have it.
yeah,
But then on the other hand, you hear a lot about cancel culture. I work in the scientific community. I'm a researcher. And so there's a lot of concern there about, even reading some of John Lennox's early encounters with his professors,
yeah,
Stephen Meyer's encounters with folks. There are concerns. They're not concerns at the level of death and martyrdom
mm.
necessarily, but there are smaller practical concerns. And so, what's your advice to people regarding those in maybe the Western world, and how does that differ for maybe different levels of threat that they might encounter?
Yeah. Oh, again, what an excellent question. I think I'd say a couple of things there, and the challenge is balancing it, because there are two sides to that question. The one is that, as you say, we're not suffering the persecution that, say, somebody may be if they come to faith from a Muslim background. I have many friends
Mhm.
who are former Muslims, and for many of them, life transformed when they became a
Yeah.
Christian. By which I mean they had to move country, they lost their family, there were real
Hmm.
costs. I've had friends who've been beaten up for their faith, who've been had death threats. When you meet people like that, or you read some of the history of the persecuted church. And actually doing that, by the way, is a good way to put a little bit of iron in your backbone of going, okay, gosh, there are men and women who have really risked all for the gospel. And if I haven't risked something for the gospel, if it hasn't cost me something,
Mhm.
how much do I really believe it? So there is that side. And I think it's important we don't entirely run away from that. I think, God does surround us by that great cloud of witnesses, as Hebrews puts it, to sort of put a bit of iron into our bellies and go, come on, look at all the people cheering us on. That's not unimportant. And I think some of us need to be reminded of that. The other side of it too is exactly as you described it, going, it can be difficult. And look, just because, if you've got a fear of being cancelled at work, having, somebody go, oh, come on, pull yourself together. That may be true. I'm not sure it's necessarily helpful. What I have found helpful over the years is I think it's helpful to name those fears. So sit down with other Christians. God puts us into community. So, particularly if you can find other people in your discipline. If you're a scientist, try and find, there are often networks of Christians across the disciplines. There's networks of Christians in science, Christians in education. Maybe they're in your church, people who are in similar disciplines. Getting together with other Christians who can support and encourage you can be helpful. Because if you try and engage in Lone Ranger evangelism, if you feel you're the only person in your workplace and you've got to stand up on your own, and it's all down to you, it's going to be very tough. But if you've got other
Yes.
brothers and sisters who come alongside you and go, let me chat about how I did that, let me encourage you, let me help you. You mentioned John Lennox, right? To go, he's blazed a trail. James Torr, another one, and Christian
Mhm.
scientist.
Mhm.
Those people who can show us the way. So look for people in your discipline who've demonstrated what it means. Try and find people around you who can stand with you. And then I think also be looking for opportunities to begin putting your head above the parapet in gentle ways. Sometimes in the workplace, I think we sort of think I've got to go from zero to literally, standing up on a table in the cafeteria at lunchtime, preaching the gospel with a
Yes.
placard, and it's terrifying. But what about if you started gently? What about if on a Monday morning you decided when someone asks the "How was your weekend?" question, you don't duck the church piece and you talk
Mm.
about your Saturday, you talk about your Sunday morning. What about if you, allow yourself to get caught at lunchtime reading, maybe not John Lennox, but maybe there are other books that might spark a question. What about taking little gentle steps, towards outing yourself at work? And then finally on this, I think the other thing that really matters here, make sure as a Christian, if you're in the workplace or if you're a student in university, make sure what you're doing with excellence. Because if your colleagues love and value you, if you are someone who puts the team first, who goes the extra mile, who is a great person to have around, yes, there are still some risks. I get that. But the risks are lower because people are going to go, I love the fact that Kathleen's on my team because she works hard. And yes, she's one of those weird religious types, but you know what? Her work's really good. And she puts in the hours and she doesn't cut corners. And
Yes.
yeah, it's hard for people to dislike you if you're serving people well. And so make sure we're doing that. And, as Peter says in First Peter chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, act with gentleness and respect and kindness in the way that we treat others. And then people are going to go, okay, what's different about you?
Mhm. Mhm. I've had some friends that I know who have received that very question. They haven't said anything outright, but people have noticed that there's something different. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with that sort of approach. But
Yeah,
there's
likewise, to go, you can
yeah,
hide behind it.
yeah,
I would say. Well, the way of hiding behind it is when I was at the workplace, I used to think if I'm a really nice person and just really kind to people, people will figure out the gospel bit, and they don't.
yeah,
They just think you're a nice person.
yeah.
So you do have to follow it through with talking about your faith a little bit so that people connect the two. Um, and then the other really easy win I learned from a friend years ago is look for ways to do things that do make you stand out at work beyond perhaps just making coffee occasionally. One really interesting one is in workplaces where people can be a bit gossipy. Not every workplace is like this, but some places are. A really interesting way to stand out as a Christian is the moment you hear anyone badmouth anybody else, say something positive about that person. First, it shuts down
Mm,
criticism. It's very hard to be backbiting someone who's out of the room if there's an annoying person in the room going, actually, I really appreciate that person. And then
yeah.
people will notice and people begin to go, what? You're always positive. I've never heard you say a. And then to go, take the opportunity to go, well, the reason I do that is just because I'm a Christian and I think everyone is made in God's
Mhm,
image. And so I try my very best to reflect that in my work relationships. I don't always get it right, but I try. So that's why I do that. And it's
mm,
hard for someone to go, oh, you're a religious nutter if you've literally just demonstrated in the way that you speak about fellow colleagues. And by the way, people also learn to trust you because if you're nice about people who are being backbitted about when they're out the room, they're going to assume when they're out of the room, you're being nice about them too. So it's
mhm.
very practical low-key win, but you have to follow it through with telling people why you're doing it. And I know it's scary and the heart will be racing a bit and the palms a bit sweaty. But again, if you've acted first and people have seen something different in you and then you've connected it to your faith, people are going to take it that little bit more seriously, I think.
Do you know about our Challenging Questions article series? Challenging Questions tackles important topics about faith in a winsome and thoughtful yet concise approach. While the answers may not be exhaustive, they address the core of the issue and will be easy to share with others. Each month is a new question addressed by a key scholar, faith, or thought leader. Our hope is that these questions and responses offer food for thought and encourage you to go deeper in your own journey and prepare you in sharing your faith. You can subscribe to receive challenging questions by scrolling down to our homepage, cslewisinstitute.org, and clicking subscribe. And you can see the published articles are at the same website, cslewisinstitute.org, by clicking on Resources and then clicking on Challenging Questions. I very much like that approach. I hear a common tactic from folks in the academic community, which is where I am, and I'm sure it's similar in other communities and industry and elsewhere. Essentially, the form of it in the university is I'm going to wait to get tenure, and then I'm going to out myself as a Christian because I know I'm going to have to die on some hill related to my faith. So I'd rather die on a higher, more visible hill than a lower hill.
Yeah.
But it takes till you're 40 years old, 45 years
Yeah.
old to get tenure. It's not an easy feat. You end up doing maybe acting in a Christian manner the whole time to get there, maybe being more silent than you wanted, maybe not acting in a Christian manner. I don't know. What do you think of an approach like that?
I can understand why somebody might take that approach, Kathleen, but I'm nervous about it for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think, and I lived this out in my case, I wasn't in the academic world at that point, that came later, but when I was working for the health service in medical education, every day that I chose not to say something, it actually got harder, and the moment never came. And for me, it might have been going, well, maybe when I'm on the senior leadership team and I work my way up to be number 2 in the department, in the education department, over my time there, but going, I never changed because it was every day it just got easier to say nothing.
Yeah.
And the danger is thinking, well, okay, when I achieve tenure, and if you're not careful, the next step is, okay, well, actually maybe when I don't know, when I get my magnum opus published, or when I become a professor, or when there's always another.
Yes.
And I think the reverse is true. I remember I've got a friend of mine who is an academic in the UK, and he said to me, he said, I'm very glad that the advice I got on day one from a colleague who was a Christian was, from day one, identify yourself as a Christian. You don't need to do more than that. But when you win a new team, for example, and people are introducing themselves, just say, I'm Andy Bannister. I'm the professor of psychiatry. I'm not, by the way. I'm just giving an example. I'm a Christian. I play hockey. I do whatever. Make it part of your little biography. Just throw it in there. That, by the way, solves the die to hill on thing. Because if somebody throws some curveball at you, you can always smile and go, look, I'm a big believer in not trying to bring faith in complicated ways into the workplace. So look, I'll happily talk about that after work, but let's just talk about the work. Don't get drawn into Trump versus Biden, or sexuality, whatever. I think you can just go, I'm not going to talk about that today, because we're here to do work. But I'm also not afraid of saying this is who I am, and particularly in a culture that encourages people to bring their whole self to work. I think it's important that Christians can bring their faith to work. My friends with political passions can bring those to work, but also we need to get on as a team. So I think it's actually easier to name it on day one, not when you go down the line. And then the other danger with going with waiting till you achieve tenure or whatever it is, I can't remember if it was Calvin or Luther. I think it was Calvin who said that the human heart is an idol making factory. And we have a horrible tendency as humans to turn good things into ultimate things, and they become terrible things. And pursuing tenure, that's a great thing to pursue. Of course it is. God has wired some of us that way. But if that becomes the main thing, such that the gospel and my love of Christ get played into second place, I just wonder, it's how great a cost is that you're paying at that price. Now, I know that's easy for me to say if someone's listening to this thinking, okay, well, basically, are you telling me I should commit academic suicide? I'm not saying that, but I am saying maybe just be careful that you haven't made a good thing into an ultimate thing. And it's going to let you down. because, as you know, you're in the world of academia. Actually, when you achieve tenure, it's probably not going to be all it's cracked up to be. It's actually not going to be everything you've dreamt of. It's going to continue to be hard work and blood, sweat, and tears. So, yeah, I would say much easier to out yourself as a Christian early on and be subtle with it at first, by all means, as you're on that road to career advancement. But actually, I think people are going to respect you far more if you're someone who's clear about your beliefs, willing to knuckle down and do the hard work. And what an
Mhm.
opportunity, by the way, on the way to tenure. That's going to involve a lot of hard work, working hard, doing long hours. People look at you and go, do you know what? They're one of those Christians, but I can't fault them academically because they're really willing to do the hard graft.
And I think too, tenure's not as safe as it used to be. It's not any promotion, any position in the world is not unbreakable. And so, if that's going to be the thing that we're going to sort of use as our anchor and then move forward from there, it might not be as firm an anchor as we think anyway. But that segues me nicely into my next question for you, which was about the content of what we should be sharing.
Yes.
So it's often, phrased as we should share the gospel. Should Christians be diving into Christianity associated perceived issues, like you mentioned, some political issues or some niche topics?
Mm.
Or should we just start by focusing on whatever we think is a salvation matter or an essential of the gospel?
Oh, what a great question. On the one hand, I want to say that we should stay away from those, sort of adjacent issues as far as we possibly can, because if you stray into politics, or if you stray into some of the big culture war issues, the danger is that, firstly, actually, you're ironically you're more likely to get yourself cancelled going there than anywhere
Hmm.
else.
Yeah.
And also, you're going to alienate people to go, if you are a Christian who, is absolutely passionate about, just to pick an example, right wing Republican politics. I'm not making any disparaging remarks about that or the other side. But if you are,
Hmm.
let's say, as Christians are often assumed to be, then if you're trying to talk to your left wing Democrat leaning friend about faith issues, they're going to write you off before you go any further. It's not fair. Totally not fair. They've written you off. I get that, but they have written you off, and they haven't written you off for a gospel issue. They've written you off for a political issue. So one thing I've learned over the years you can do is, if you're passionate about an area, can you talk about it in a neutral kind of way? Like, if politics does come up, in the workplace, sometimes it does, much better, I think, to say things like, gosh, isn't it tough living in a time where, everything seems so divided? How do we bring, people together? Or as a Christian, I'm concerned that what we see as is people kind of throwing, sort of, hand grenades at each other rather than finding ways to disagree kindly. So you can talk about the issue, but try and do so in a way that's not divisive. The other thing you can sometimes do is start with the issue that you're given and find a way to bridge gently to the gospel. So, for example, another hot button issue, if, say, sexuality comes up, rather than wading straight into, well, let me tell you what I think about Christian morality and that issue, which again is probably not the good starting point. What might be interesting is to say, hey, I'm fascinated by the fact that we all think sexuality really matters. Christians think it does. Our more progressive friends think that it does. But I'm intrigued. Why do you think that issue matters? After all, if there is no God, we're just mammals whose only purpose is survival and reproduction, and mating and reproductive fitness. But the fact that you've raised this issue tells me you don't think that at all. I, as a Christian, don't either. But why do you think what
Hmm.
you think? Um, and what you've done there, you've done an Act 17. You've done what Paul does in Athens, where he comes across the altars of the unknown God. Paul has no time for idolatry, but he doesn't go in and, launch both barrels at the Athenians. He goes in and goes, I was impressed by how religious you were, and I was really surprised and walked around your city in amazement. And then I saw this altar, and that got me thinking. And as you'll know, one of the things we talk about in the yellow How to Talk About Jesus book is there's a whole chapter on wandering questions.
Hmm.
How do you start from where somebody is and sort of wander your way across the gospel? And I think I've seen in workplace settings and university settings, that's a really interesting way of doing it, because it means you can stay away from, you don't run away from the hot button issues, but you come sideways from them and get people thinking about the bigger questions behind them.
Mm.
Does that help a little bit?
Yes, it does. I really enjoyed that chapter, and I was wondering if you could give our listeners, for those who haven't read it yet, some example questions which offer ways to open up a conversation without making someone defensive, especially questions that could be used a little bit more organically when you haven't been perhaps directly confronted, but you want to start a conversation.
Yeah. So the whole wandering approach starts from the basis that there's been numerous studies actually showing that across the Western world, society is becoming less atheistic. I think the UK is leading the charge here. There's a survey showing now that generations Gen Z, are actually the
Mhm.
least atheist generation of a long time. 20% of young men aged 25 and under are now going to church once a month, which is, I
Mhm.
think, an incredible leap from the
Yeah.
last time the stats were done 5 years ago. Same trends beginning in the USA and in Canada. So I think people are open to spiritual conversations. They just don't have the language to engage in them anymore. And so, if we're not careful as Christians, we come in, sort of using our old school questions about the Bible and Christian faith, and they don't
Mhm.
connect, and that's where things go wrong. But if you start where people are at, you can do all kinds of things. So, one of the examples I use in the book is, we live in a culture that's so obsessed is pejorative word. I can't think of a better word than obsessed, but that really, really cares about justice. That is
Mhm.
probably one of the defining issues in our culture, whether it's racial justice or environmental justice, whatever it is. Most of our friends, neighbors, colleagues, classmates, justice matters to them, and that I think is a wonderful gospel opportunity. And if you're sitting down, in the staff canteen at work or wherever at lunchtime, and that your friend is surfing through the news on their phone, and they see some story out of the Middle East, and they make some comment about, isn't it terrible what's going on in Gaza? Sometimes as Christians, we're very quick to leap in and go, well, let me give you my opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe don't do that. What about saying, that's interesting? What was the story you've read? And get them to tell you and to go, gosh, that's really, yeah, what a story. Tell me, why does that get you passionate? And they'll go, it's a terrible abuse of human rights. Yeah, I agree with you. Hey, just out of interest, why do you think human rights matter? What do you think it is about humans that mean that, when the things that you've just described are done to them, that's wrong? Um, and what you're doing is, you haven't mentioned God, you haven't mentioned Christianity, but you're nudging them gently. Where you want to go with that ultimately is to go, I agree with you, it's terrible. I agree. The reason I think it's terrible is I'm a Christian, and I believe that human beings are not just atoms and particles, but are made in the very image of God and are of infinite value, which is why justice really, really matters and human rights really matters. But you don't start there. You want to start with where your friend is at. And very quickly, you'll find if you start asking those kind of questions to your friend, they'll run out of steam quite quickly, and they'll sort of run into, well, kind of, I suppose everybody knows. And you go, well, clearly everybody doesn't, because that's why human rights abuses happen.
Mhm.
Um, and then you can start from the justice and human rights thing. And before you know it, you're able to then, introduce the Christian understanding here and go, look, I don't know what you believe or don't believe. But what I do know is we desperately need a foundation for things like human rights and justice. I don't think we can get there from we're just stuff. I do think
Yeah.
Christianity gives a really interesting framework that allows us to find a basis for things that we care about. What do you think?
Mm.
And I find using that approach, you'll open the conversation up. And it's not always easy. There'll be pushbacks. It will go in strange directions. You've still got to bring Jesus and the gospel in there. But because you've started from where someone is at, you're going to see, I think, far more fruit in that conversation. And again, back to Paul in Athens, that's what he does with the altar to the unknown God. He starts from there, and he basically says to the Athenians, hey, have you guys ever wondered what this unknown God is that you've bothered to build an altar to? Have you ever thought about it? Well, why don't I tell you?
Mm. I like that approach very much because it lets the other person guide you to where their issues are and where their, individual struggles are concerning Christianity, rather than you just pushing your own narrative and forcing it and asking your own leading questions. It's a very timely story too, because I recently had somebody who doesn't know me very well ask me very pointedly and sort of out of the blue, oh, I know you're Christian, and I know that Christians are passionate about pro life and they care about the life of the fetus. Why do they not care about children being killed in Gaza?
Mm,
And that was a big whoa. Okay, let's step back. They absolutely care about
yeah.
children being killed. And let's talk about, the value of human life and protecting the weak.
Although I agree, it can be hard in the moment, but to just pause briefly, count to two, right? And go,
Mhm.
wow, what a question, and what a really good question. But
Yeah.
before I answer it, can I just gently turn it around to you? You obviously think that children dying in Gaza is wrong. Tell me, why do you think it's wrong? What is it that leads you to conclude that's a bad thing?
Mm.
Um, and what will happen is most people, I think, are actually ending up sort of parked on the sort of bits and pieces of the Christian worldview they've cobbled together. They want to hang on to the idea that human beings have value. They want to hang on to the
Yeah.
idea that we're not just a random collection of atoms, but they
Mhm.
haven't got the story that informs that. So without engaging in gotcha moments, I think I would start by, and Jesus does this all the time, right? You turn the tables, ask them the question first, and just probe a little bit, and then you could come over and say, well, that's really interesting. Look, as a Christian, this is what I think, and talk about the fact that I think everybody
Mhm.
is, every life is inestimably precious, demonstrated by Jesus dying for us. That's how valuable we are. And then I think even be humble and go, I completely recognize that Christians are not always as good at being consistent. We do sometimes perhaps give the impression, we care more about the life in the womb than the life of the child in Gaza. Whereas
Yeah.
actually, if we bear the image of God, both lives are equally important. If we are just
Absolutely.
atoms in motion, neither life matters, quite
Mhm.
frankly, and all we have is the will to power, to quote the famous
Mhm.
atheist Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes.
But you're right to challenge Christians on not being as consistent as we should be. And taking that approach, you do a couple of things. You've turned the tables on them a little bit and got them to think about their foundations. You've started from their issue and not got defensive and just come across to the starting point for the gospel, right? That we're not just atoms and particles. And I think if you do that little bit of humility and don't get defensive and be willing to go to your skeptical friend, you do partly have a fair point.
Mhm.
um the thing you shouldn't do, I think, is as I say, get all political and go, right, I'm going to score some points here, because nobody wins at that point.
Okay. So we've talked about a lot of these conversations in a sort of one-on-one context. How do we handle talking in a small group or in a larger context? Is that something that, let's say, a lay apologist should even attempt to do? Or is somebody, perhaps a Christian listening, who's new to apologetics or seeking to get better, should they stick to those one on one conversations before branching out?
Oh wow, what a great question. I think the answer I would give there, Kathleen, is really see what God brings across your path. I mean, that's always been my own kind of journey. I mean, obviously, we started this conversation with Speaker's Corner for me, which
Mm.
was up a ladder with a crowd. But in one sense, I didn't go looking for that. It came looking for me. When I went up to London to see what my now friend Jay, was doing, I had no intention of going anywhere near a ladder. I got kind of forced into one. So I'm a
Mhm.
great believer, in saying you be praying. If you want to share your faith more, start with prayer and pray, Lord, I want to share more. I want to present. I want to talk to more people about Christ. Would you create some opportunities for me? Whether that's a small group, whether it's just a random comment a friend makes at work, or someone I bump into, in the subway or at the bus stop, whatever it is, you know, ask God to create those opportunities, and then look to be stepping into them. You'd be amazed how often when you start praying for opportunities, the Lord
Mm.
creates the opportunities. And yeah, for some people it might be a group setting. For others, it might just be one to one. Don't rule either out, and don't go searching for opportunities that He hasn't created.
Mm. I think we often forget to pray for things like that. So that's a great reminder for us. And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is I in my church small group, I asked folks what was their main fear about
Mm,
apologetics. And these are women who have been in the faith for many years. They have, fairly strong theological knowledge and spiritual maturity about them. They're what one would say is reasonably prepared, right? As much as someone could be. And the number one fear that I got was the fear of debate. That if
mm,
someone switches into a debate mode against you, you're not going to have the facts to come back at them. You're not going to be able to say, well, the four gospels were written this many years after Jesus's death, and at this archaeological site there's evidence for the city of Jericho, and just pull out all of these
mm.
facts like a
Like a machine.
professional. Yes. So what would you say to folks like that, and how
Yeah.
do we handle someone switching into debate mode with us?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, I think it's interesting that someone's impression of apologetics was that's what it looks like,
Uh-huh.
which I find fascinating. I think that does show the word apologetics has got a bit of a bad name, and
Mm.
actually at Solas, the ministry I lead, we rarely use the word apologetics because I think it comes freighted with all kinds of misconceptions. Either people who are afraid of it, or the other thing I meet the apologetics junkies who actually can recite every biblical manuscript in
Yes.
chronological order, while standing on their head, and they terrify me. Whereas the phrase we prefer to use is persuasive evangelism, which I think
Mm.
is a rough translation of apologetics. How do we engage in evangelism that's persuasive? And persuasion can be different in different settings. First Peter 3:15, which is the famous verse that says, "Be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have," also goes on to say that our lives are part of that reason. Our lives should be persuasive. People should look at us and go, "There is something different about you." Persuasion can look very different in different settings. So that's the first thing I would say. So I would want to be with that kind of group gently, perhaps even beginning by saying, "Where did you get the idea that that's what apologetics has to be?"
Mm.
Second thing, I guess I'd reassure people by going, very rarely do I end up in debate settings and everyday conversation. Where I would normally end up in them is if I've stood up the front and given a talk at university, which is a deliberate public space event, and students
Sure.
brought friends, and it's in a sense, come along and hear a Christian give a compelling, hopefully God willing, compelling presentation. Doesn't tend to happen in one-to-one settings. People have questions by all means, and then I
Mhm.
would say if there's a question that comes, you know, if you know the answer, share it in a non-confrontational way. Just go, that's a really good question. I wonder if you've considered that this might be helpful. If you partly know the answer, again, don't try and do more than you can. Just be honest and go, hey, that's a great question. Just a couple of thoughts. I don't have everything here, but a couple of thoughts. I wonder if you've thought about X and Y. And then thirdly, if you don't know the answer, I found a really helpful approach over the years, Kathleen, is to say to the person, that's a really good question. Look, forgive me for asking, but does that question really matter to you? If you got a really good
Mm.
answer to that question, would you take a serious look at Jesus? If they go no,
Mm.
to go, well, okay, let's move on then, because there's no point playing
Yeah.
games, right? If they
Yeah.
say, well, actually, I might, then say, look, I'll be honest, I don't know the answer, but I think I know some people who might, because I know people who are much smarter than I am. I'll tell you what, would you leave that with me? And I will see if I can go and find an answer, because it's a really good
Mm.
question, and then I'll come back to you. And then be true to your word. Talk to an older, wiser Christian. Talk to a pastor. Go and visit the C.S. Lewis Institute website or the Solas website with the kind of resources there. Take the time, because what a great opportunity then to go back to that person and go, hey, well, thank you for that question you raised last week. And, I did some thinking, did some reading, and hey, I actually think I've come up with an answer. And by the way, doing that allows you to print out the answer if you need to. If it's like something from a website, you can go, look, I
Yes.
found this essay written by a professor of historical manuscripts or something who addresses your question. I went digging for you. What do you think? Have a look. And that then turns it out of a kind of massively confrontational debate, you versus them
Mm.
kind of piece. You can't always avoid those things, but in my experience, they are rarer, and perhaps our fear of them is bigger than the reality.
Mm. And I hope that's reassuring for folks listening in as well. I think apologetics, you're definitely right, sometimes gets a reputation for being this academic discipline, and that you have to be a professional theologian to engage in it. And otherwise, you're just not doing it justice. And that's absolutely not true. And
I mean, look at C.S. Lewis. He was an academic, right? He was a
Mhm.
bright guy, but he was not a trained theologian.
Yeah.
And he was sometimes criticized for that, by the way, by trained theologians who got a bit sort of their noses put out of joint that he was a
Hmm.
professor of literature engaging in the field, but he didn't stop him. And he wrote brilliant books of, perhaps more traditional apologetics. Perhaps we might think of Mere Christianity as the one that many people have read. But then look, he also does narrative apologetics. We can forget that the Chronicles of Narnia are an
Hmm.
apologetic in written form. They're an apologetic for the beauty of the gospel. Many people have read those stories, and that's been their way into the gospel. And also woven into those stories, Lewis will often address apologetic arguments, but in narrative form. So, there's a lovely illustration, given this is the C.S. Lewis Institute podcast, that actually, our eponymous friend demonstrated that you don't need to be a trained theologian. He took the gifts that he had. He was a writer and a thinker, and he used them to articulate the gospel. So that tells me if you're an academic listening to this, you can do this. But equally, if you're an office worker or a housewife or house husband or a bus driver or a student, whatever it is, pray to the Lord and go, Lord, how can I use the gifts that you've given me to share the gospel in a way that engages my friends, my colleagues, in a way that's appropriate?
Yes, absolutely. And like you said too, you may be the only Christian that has access to your friends and your colleagues, and you may be the only one they're going to encounter. So
Hmm.
that's very important to remember. And I'd love to discuss in the book, you talk about looking for gaps in others' worldviews.
Yes.
So I was wondering, what are some of the more common worldviews you encounter, and how are those different in the different countries you've worked in? Maybe we could do UK versus USA, because I think a lot of people have in their minds the new atheists, the sort of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins,
Yeah.
and is that really what's going on the ground, and is that what you see, or
Hmm.
do you see something else?
Um, Not any longer on the ground. And in fact, this is sort of interesting timing because my first popular book in 2014 was The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, which was an engagement with the new atheism. And we
Mhm.
literally have coming out in the UK in 2 weeks' time and in the US later in the summer, the 10th anniversary edition of The
Oh,
Atheist Who Didn't
nice.
Exist. And what's happened in those 10 years, of course, the new atheism as it fizzled out,
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett, two of the famous new atheists from back then, they're dead.
Mhm.
So arguably they're doing empirical research now into the God question. Um, who else? We got Sam Harris has become some
Mhm.
kind of weird Buddhisty, new agey type who's doing podcasts on mindfulness and annoying a lot of his former fans who think that he's become religious. And then you've got Dawkins, who is now come out and said, "Oh, well, I'm actually a cultural Christian," and is
Yes.
saying nice things about Christianity.
Yes.
He's very clear he doesn't believe it, but he thinks it might actually be good compared to the alternative. So the
Mhm.
whole thing has changed, and then we have certainly what in the UK scene has come to be called the surprising rebirth of belief in God, to quote the title of a book by a friend of mine, showing that now you've got a whole number of public intellectual figures who 10 years ago would have all been atheists, but I think are now talking positive about Christian faith, whether that's the historian Tom Holland, or you've got
Mhm.
the kind of feminist academic Louise Perry and others
Mhm.
who are, making really big names for themselves as public thinkers and intellectuals, but they either are Christians or almost there. So that's all shifted. And then the other movement that's going on in the UK, and I alluded to this earlier, and I think the US is actually not far behind. We've also seen this amazing awakening among young people, where I think a lot of young people now are reconsidering faith again. We're seeing amazing statistics in the UK in terms of young people attending churches. Christian campus groups are seeing all kinds of things kind of going on. And I would say we've gone, if I go and do a university event now, 5, 10 years ago, the questions would have been, faith and science or, those kind of
Mhm.
questions.
Mhm.
Now the questions are more, where can I find hope in the world, or how can
Oh, yeah.
Christianity help with the question of meaning or whatever. The questions have shifted from is
Mm.
Christianity true to what difference does it make. That's the starting point. And I would say the
Mm.
US, and I've just come off a sabbatical tour in the US. I was 3 months over there, did 9 CS Lewis centers actually as part of that tour. It was interesting doing some campus events as part of that. Very struck by, I did an event at Jamestown University in West Virginia, and I was talking to one of the campus ministry leaders there, who she said, "Look, I'm responsible. I've got 4 year groups here that I look after at this university." She said, the fourth years, the older ones, the group is kind of sort of so big. The third year is a bit bigger. Second year is much bigger. The first years, we've got so many of them, we can hardly find a room big enough to put them all in.
Oh,
She said, "I
wow.
don't know what's happening. All I can say is the younger we go, the more the passion, the
Mhm.
more the interest. The Christians are more
Mhm.
fired up, and the non-Christians are much more willing to come to events and engage in spiritual questions." So I think there's a real shift happening in culture, and as Christians, I think it's vital we're ready for that. That we're listening to the questions that are being asked, and not assume we know what those questions are because they were being asked 10 years ago. The new atheism is over. The arguments it advanced are still kicking around. You'll still hear them online. People will still come out with arguments that Dawkins was advancing 10 years ago. We need to be able to engage with those, but we're also living in very, very, very interesting times because, and you raised the question of worldview, I don't think the other worldviews out there are sustainable. And the idea that the humanistic
Mm.
one, which is the one that the West has tried to live by, I think, for the last 40, 50 years, in that we can throw God out the window, but we can still have meaning, we can still have hope, we can still have, the common good, we can still have human rights. It's failed utterly. It's failed utterly. And again, this brings us back to C.S. Lewis, right? Because what led him to faith in his 30s, all the things he cared about, he finally worked out they don't work. If Christianity is true, you can't have meaning and beauty and music and literature and joy and all these things. And as he suddenly realized that, and the light bulb came on, then of course he became a Christian, as he realized that actually it made sense of everything that he was already passionate about. And I think we've got a lot of people who are in that similar kind of space right
Mm.
now. So I'm excited. And there's been some great stuff happening in the US too, of course. I mean, look at the Asbury revival, as so-called, not that long ago. Just one data point on the graph, but I think an
Yeah.
important one. So I'm encouraged. There's a lot of work to be done. We live in challenging times, yes, but also Aslan is on the move, as C.S. Lewis would say.
Are you familiar with the C.S. Lewis Institute's website? It's quite popular. Each month, there are about 160,000 unique visitors who come to the website from all around the globe. It's a tremendous resource, but today I just want to point out only one part of the website. As you know, the C.S. Lewis Institute has been around for nearly 50 years, and in that time they have written or had written hundreds or thousands of excellent discipleship articles. There are so many of them it can be a bit overwhelming, but you can simply go to the website cslewisinstitute.org, look under resources, and there you can explore by topic. Interested in apologetics, evangelism, grace, love? We have those topics and many more. Again, the website is cslewisinstitute.org, and it's a tool you are sure to find helpful. Yes, that's very encouraging to hear about the younger folks, and very interesting that the nature of the questions are shifting from sort of maybe a more debate-minded, knowledge-focused, scientific stance to, how is this applicable? How is this going to matter? How can I get hope? Things like that. Um, that brings me into one of the questions that I had for you, and I was hoping we could talk about, or one of the main objections I hear to Christianity, which is all religions are the same.
Well, the first thing I would say, I always like to begin by saying, if someone asks that question, I like to gently sort of turn it around and say, look, if I was to say to you, look, I've got a really big, really significant money saving tip for you. And my money saving tip is this: you never need to buy another book, because every book in the bookstore is identical. Every book is the same. They're literally the same. The only
Mhm.
people who are telling you otherwise are publishers and authors who are trying to sell you stuff. It's all a money making racket. But trust me, every book is the same. And I like to say to somebody, would you conclude, if I said that to you, would you conclude that, number one, wow, thank you, Andy, that's the most amazing thing ever. I knew Brits were a special race and you've saved me a fortune. I never need to buy another book. Or would you conclude, Andy Bannister has clearly never read more than one book in his life, because there's no way anyone could advance that claim if they'd looked for a moment. And of course, it is the latter.
Yes.
And then I gently say, look, with the greatest respect, when someone says to me, all the world's religions are essentially the same, what that tells me is they haven't really looked at any of them. Because when
Yeah.
you do look at them, there are massive, massive differences. I mean, take just, some really obvious low hanging fruit for a moment. Buddhism in its classic form is atheistic. It doesn't believe in a god. And really, the idea is that if you master the truths and the teachings of Buddhism, then ultimately you can kind of be absorbed into the cosmic everything and achieve ultimate oneness with the universe, and so be it. No god anywhere to be seen. Then we have Islam and Christianity. Islam, the Quran claims that Jesus was never crucified. The Quran rejects most of the core teachings of Christianity, but it rejects the crucifixion, which is, by the way, a historical claim. um, Christianity, on the other hand, is centered on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So both those claims can't be true. Jesus can't be both
Mhm.
crucified and not crucified. Um, and so it goes on. When you start comparing religious traditions, they look very, very, very different. And in the book I wrote a few years ago on this, I wrote a book called The Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God. To help people navigate this, I suggest, I love questions, as we've seen in this podcast, Kathleen. So I just suggest 4 questions you can ask. Is there a God, and what is God like? What is a human being? What's gone
Mhm.
wrong with the world? And what's the solution? And if you put those 4 questions to any religious tradition you like, by the way, including atheism, because every human being has to answer those questions in some ways, the differences stack up. And that shouldn't surprise us. That it shouldn't. That's not something to be afraid of. I think it's something to lean into and go, this is really interesting. This means, you know what, I'm going to have to do some work. I can't be lazy and go, I can pick what I like, or they're all the same. There are differences, and the differences make a difference.
Mm. Yes, those 4 questions are very, very helpful. I'd love to quickly touch on the um, crucifixion of Jesus and sort of that counterpoint between Islam and Christianity that you mentioned. Should you go to the historical evidence or
Hmm.
should you go to something upstream, and how would you handle that?
Gosh, there's a great question. I mean, certainly with a Muslim friend, I would love to be talking about, hey, let's talk about Jesus. You know, there are about 90
Mhm.
verses in the Quran that mention Jesus. You might say to your Muslim friend, hey, you know, I don't really know much about the Quran. Tell me what the Quran says. And then where I often like to go is say, hey, I understand the Quran says that Jesus taught people, which it does. Um,
Mhm.
what are some of your favorite teachings of Jesus? And your Muslim friend is probably going to get stuck at that point because the Quran contains none of them. And then I would use that as an opportunity to go, well, hey, would you like me to share with you one of Jesus' stories? He loved telling stories, and there are many in the Bible. Can I share one with you? And I tend to find Muslims love the stories of Jesus actually, because Islam is a Middle Eastern story based culture in many ways, and so you're
Mhm.
away. You don't need to wade straight into the crucifixion. When you come to it, I would say a couple of things there to my Muslim friends. I would say first thing is to go, but before we look at the crucifixion on its own, we need to look at the teachings of Jesus. And are you aware? You might say to them that Jesus predicted his own death. It wasn't a random thing. He knew it was coming. Your Muslim friend probably isn't aware of that, and to go, let me show you, and give them a couple of examples from the gospel. So it's not like the crucifixion was a random thing. Jesus was heading that way and predicted that was what's going to happen. And then if you want to go a little bit more historical critical, you can say, hey, just out of interest, when was the Quran written? Do you know the dates? And of course, Muhammad's public ministry was from 610 to 632 AD, so it's 600 years after Jesus. And to go, here we have in the Gospels, we have documents that were written, by the eyewitnesses within 70, before 70 AD, I think we're fairly safe because that's the date of the destruction of Jerusalem, and there's no
Mhm.
sense of that being reflected in the Gospels. I think that's a really good date to go for. So we're talking within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And by the way, the first Christians, believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and the Messiah was supposed to defeat the Romans, not get crucified by them. It's an embarrassment. So there's no reason for the first Christians to make that up. But then the next place I would go with Muslims is to go, but here's a bigger thing. Of course, the Gospels don't end with the crucifixion; they end with the resurrection. Jesus
Mhm.
predicted he would rise again, and he did kind of rise again. That's what started the early church. But now we have a mystery in the Quran. The Quran doesn't know about the resurrection of Jesus. Doesn't rebut it, doesn't deny it,
Mm.
doesn't know that's what Christians believe. If you read the Quran, 114 chapters of the Quran, you would not at the end of it go, "Oh, okay, I get it. Christians believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and the Quran has rejected those things." I often say to Muslim friends, if I wrote a 300-page textbook on Islam and I didn't mention Muhammad once, you'd
Yes.
probably conclude I'd missed something, that I didn't know what I was talking about. Well, I look at the
Mm.
Quran, which purports to talk about Jesus. It doesn't even know about the resurrection. So that's a difficulty. So look, why don't we start with the original and go from there? Now, if you end up in that place, you're going to get into debate. We've talked about debate. Your
Mhm.
Muslim friend will raise questions, and that's okay. But I'd try and start first of all with getting them to look at Jesus rather than getting the arguments about Jesus, because so many of the Muslims I know who've come to faith in Christ, it was the attraction to Jesus that drove them
Mm.
there. Yes, there
Okay.
were questions along the way, but primarily there was an attraction to the person of Jesus. And by the way, for anyone listening, if you want a really crackingly good read on this, there's a wonderful book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus,
Mm.
written
Mhm.
by a late friend of mine. He's no longer with us. A guy called Nabil Qureshi. Nabil was a Pakistani convert from Islam to Christianity, and that was in his book Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. That's his testimony. That was a New York Times bestseller, 1 million copies sold. It's an amazing read, and it's really interesting to see his journey. Yes, there's apologetics along the way, but primarily it was that Jesus drew him in. He found Jesus really compelling, not
Mm.
so much just the arguments of Christians, although those were helpful. And even then, it's important for those of us who love argument to remember that you can't argue someone into faith,
Yeah.
right? To go, arguments
Hmm.
are important to you, but there'd have been moments that were beyond argument too, I suspect. In fact, one of C.S. Lewis's great heroes, one great friends, was a guy called Austin Farrer, who was a theologian at Oxford. And Austin has this nice line where he says, arguments can't create faith, but they can create a climate in which faith is possible. By
Mm.
which he means if you've got intellectual objections like perhaps you had, arguments really matter to clear that debris away. But then there
Yes.
still comes that point of going, I have to personally say yes to Jesus.
Yes. That's a great quote. And that's very much in line with, I don't know what you think about the reenchantment movement nowadays, but especially, out of Eastern Orthodoxy, this idea of sort of bringing people back to the numinous, the beautiful, as a way to experience the divine, not just to learn about it intellectually.
I I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. Like everything, I'm a typical Brit. I'm always yes, but
Yes.
there's a lot of good stuff there. And then again, what's interesting personally for me, I found yes, I'm an intellectual and I'm a thinker. I'm wired that way, but I also know yes, some of the most profound experiences I've had of the presence and the closeness of God, the numinous, if you want to use that wonderful word,
Mhm.
have been through either music. Sometimes when a piece of music is really connected with me, sometimes it's a piece of Christian music, sometimes it's a piece of classical music, and then nature. I love the outdoors. I'm a hiker and mountaineer. That's what I like to do for
Mhm.
fun. And there've been times where back in early June, when we were out in the USA, we took the kids to Yosemite, and you stand
Oh,
there at
nice.
Glacier Point in Yosemite at sunset, and I was moved to tears because of going, this is so beautiful and so
Mhm.
part of me is like, how can anyone not see there's a God? Because it's like written
Yeah.
in this landscape. But I remember coming away just going, wow, just this incredible sense of both the beauty and the
Mhm.
awesomeness and the presence of God. So it was a lovely numinous moment, which transcends arguments in some ways.
Yes,
But I
yes.
still love a good argument.
The last question I wanna ask you is one that I get different flavors of all the time,
Hmm.
and it's some version of Christian hypocrisy.
Right.
I get it in reference to, um, pedophilia in the church a lot. That's a pretty
Hmm.
common one. You get it in reference to, slavery, and yes, they abolished it, but the Christian nations perpetuated it. And so, how do we deal with the fact that yes, Christians will say, "Oh, Christians are not perfect. The church is like a hospital. We're sinners too." But then shouldn't there be some fruits of the spirit that we're seeing that make Christians look, like we were talking about earlier, different than someone who doesn't have the Holy Spirit indwelling in them? So what's the
Yeah.
proper way to answer that?
Oh gosh. I mean, what a question, and a tough question because it operates like that question can operate on many levels, can't you? Can't it? There's an
Yeah.
intellectual component to it, but also I think a kind of an emotional, pastoral component to it,
Mhm.
and some of the toughest questions have that. Um, yeah, there's a number of ways of doing it. I think the first thing I would always want to introduce in there is I want to be careful. I would want to get the focus off the church and onto Jesus as rapidly as possible, because the church
Okay.
is, as I think Tim Keller said, is it's not a museum for saints, it's a hospital for sinners, and
Mhm.
therefore actually you're going to get mess and brokenness in the church because it's designed to attract people who are messy and broken. And in one sense, I'd be, the kind of people who end up in the church, it's hardly a surprise that you're going to get problems when you've got a community where you've got, former liars, cheats, drunkards, tax fiddlers, adulterers, and all the other
Mhm.
debris in there. You're going to get some chaos. And so once it doesn't surprise me. On the other hand, when I look at some of the transformed lives, I think that's interesting because the power of transformation is the interesting one to go. Yes, there's the mess and the debris, but there's also stories that that stand out. I mean, he'll be desperately embarrassed if he listens to this, but within the C.S. Lewis community, one of my dear friends is Tom Tarrants,
I was just
and
gonna mention him,
I mean
yes.
Tom, right? For people who don't know Tom, he met him. It was hilarious because we spent some time with him, a few weeks ago, and when my kids met him, he's this gentle,
Yeah.
slow, southern spoken,
Yeah.
grandfatherly type. My kids loved him, and to go when I told them his story, to go, yeah, he looks like that now. In 1960s, he was like the number two on the FBI most wanted list because he was a
Yeah.
vicious terrorist. He was a Ku Klux Klansman, and the FBI decided they were rather, they weren't going to try and arrest him. They're going to just try and take him out because he was such a monster. and ends up not dying in a hail of bullets, but thrown into a jail, and still took a while in jail before God got hold of him and dealt with him, and then he came out a transformed man and has worked in reconciliation over the years. And his story, his book, is in Consumed by Hate, Redeemed by Love. That
Mhm.
story, you read that story and you go, okay, what is going on here? Because what is it? What is the power that can transform someone who is consumed by hatred into the utter difference? And to go, this church is full of those kind of stories. So that's the first thing. That doesn't mean we're not guilty of the other stuff, but I think that there is a
Yeah.
lot of the transformation when you look is the first thing. Secondly, is when someone raises that question, is to go, I will sometimes say, do you know what it sounds to me like you're saying is that the church should be more like Jesus? And I agree with you, but let's look at the criteria that you're holding us to. You're saying the church should be more Jesus like. And by the way, that's why I think people get angry when the church doesn't measure up, because even our non Christian friends know the thing should be different.
Mhm.
And that's why it
Yeah.
stinks when it isn't. But then I want to say to people, look, you've got a choice here. You either have to conclude that Jesus was who he claimed to be, and there really is a God, and he really does love us, mess and chaos and hypocrisy and all, and actually justice really does matter, and right really is right, and wrong really is wrong, and some of the things you've described really do matter. Or on the other hand, Jesus was, I don't know, a liar, a deceiver, a lunatic, you're into C.S. Lewis trilemma, go whatever you like.
Mhm.
Nothing matters. It's all particles in motion. We're nothing more than clever primates whose job is to reproduce, in which case, who gives a flying monkeys? Who cares how we treat one another? Nature doesn't care. Animals don't worry.
Yeah.
Monkeys mistreat each other all the time. Human beings are just that. Yes, it annoys you, but just live with it, mate.
Yeah.
That's the alternative. Which story would you rather live in? The story where the church sometimes makes mistakes and we should jolly well hold it to account and call people back to that message of Jesus, or actually nothing matters, Nietzsche was right and it's nihilism all the way down? I think for all of
Mm.
its faults, I go for the church story and the Jesus story. Firstly, because I think it's true, but secondly, I think the alternative is so dire and so dark and so miserable that we can't live it out. And the fact we can't live it out probably tells me that it isn't true. So that's the kind of
Mm.
space that I might play in while listening carefully, asking questions, and being willing to take a few blows. Don't feel you have to defend everything. Sometimes it's okay and it's appropriate to go, yeah, that's a good question. I wish I had an
Yeah.
answer. I get equally
Yeah.
frustrated at times too. But the reason
Mhm.
I hang on is, and then point to some of those examples of transformed lives, and then point to the Jesus who is the one who does the transforming.
Mm. That's a very helpful answer. And thank you so much for all of your help for all of us listening that are going to be trained up in apologetics after listening to this and reading your book and ready to go have some of those one on one conversations and start to open up a little bit more. And I'd love to close with a quote from one of your books. This is from The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. I just personally like this quote. You wrote, "If there is no God, then humankind is not designed, purposed, or planned. There is nothing we are intended to be. All that we hold dear, all of our dreams, ambitions, goals, and accomplishments are pure accidents of atoms. Furthermore, no matter how high we squirm up the greasy pole of existence, no matter how enlightened we become, all of it, the whole cathedral of human accomplishment, is destined to become no more than rubble buried beneath the debris of the end of the universe, utterly ruined, pitch dark, cold as death, achingly alone." It reminds me a little bit of the Ozymandias poem for
Yes.
the Christian precursor.
That
Yeah.
might have been in the back of my mind. And also, as you read that, I had to go, do you know what? I think also it reminds me of the famous Bertrand Russell quote. Bertrand Russell, who wrote Why I'm Not a Christian, has this line where
Yeah.
he talks about, yes, or the whole temple of man's achievement ends up buried beneath the rubble of universe in ruins. And I quote him in
Hmm.
the book. And I think without overdoing it, at the same time, I think to present our friends, Kathleen, with that choice of going, the choice is not Christianity or, some other version of rainbows, kittens, and unicorns over here where
Yeah.
everything's happy and wonderful, of going,
Yeah.
if there is no God, you have to be willing to live with the reality of what that entails. The atheist physicist Lawrence M. Krauss from Arizona State, I think, put it even more bluntly. He said, we are a 1% bit of pollution in the
Mm.
universe. And we might not like that, but that is the reality. But then I'll often say to my friends, I often like with secular friends, I'll often use those kind of quotes when I come across them. I like to save them, and it's interesting when
Mhm.
you use those with people and to say to your friend, do you agree with that? And very rarely have I met somebody go, yes. Most people go, that's horrific. There's a reason that Lawrence is not a motivational speaker. It's depressing. And then go, yeah, well, now you've got a choice, right? Either evolution has played a cruel trick on us, it's thrown us up through time plus chance plus natural selection, and we're the only creature in the entire universe who cannot live with reality. Squirrels don't sit around having existential crises,
Mhm.
and evolution has tricked us and deceived us. Or the reason we can't live with that is we are not intended to, because that is not the real story. In which
Mhm.
case, maybe we need to take a look at what the real story is. And the best real story that I see, the best bet claimed to be the real story, is Christianity. And at the very least, you can say to a friend, take a look, because if it's the Jesus way or total grim despair, surely you'd be a fool at least not to take a look at Jesus before you jump to conclusions that could be life changing in terms of just how awfully depressing they are if you go down the pit.
Absolutely. So, on that note, thank you so much for all your wisdom that you've shared with us. And I hope that this has left, if anybody's listening who is not a Christian, who might be hostile to Christianity, entertaining Christianity, wherever you are, I hope this has given you some questions to ask other people, some food for thought. And thank you for listening to the C.S. Lewis Institute's Questioning Belief podcast. God bless and see you next time.